We're optimizing our operational overhead, Harold. Your position has been made redundant. The words were delivered with the slick, practiced indifference of someone who had rehearsed them in front of a mirror. They thought firing me would be the end of the story. They were wrong. My name is Harold Brennan. I'm 54 years old. For 31 of those years, I was the Senior Safety Compliance Officer at the Chempro Industries plant in Port Arthur. For 31 years, my signature was the final word on whether a million-gallon tank of sulfuric acid was safe, whether a pipeline carrying anhydrous ammonia was sound, and whether the men and women working the floor would go home to their families at the end of their shift. The man delivering the news was Todd Vance. He was 32, with a fresh MBA from Wharton, and the kind of unearned confidence that comes with being the new chief operating officer's brother-in-law. He wore a Brioni suit that probably cost more than my first car, and his office on the third floor still had the new paint smell. My office, for 3 decades, had been a windowless room in the plant's concrete heart, smelling of ozone and oiled steel. As you know, he continued, steepling his perfectly manicured fingers, we're moving toward a more agile, data-driven paradigm. We appreciate your long service, of course. He slid a thin folder across the polished mahogany table. It landed with a soft, final thud. This contains your severance package. It's quite generous. I didn't open it. I looked past him at the man standing awkwardly by the door. That was Barry. Barry used to sell BMWs at the dealership downtown. Last week, he'd been appointed as my replacement. His qualifications consisted of being Todd's college roommate. He wouldn't know a pressure release valve from a fire hydrant, but he had a firm handshake and a great smile. A dead calm settled over me. There was no surge of anger, no knot in my stomach. It was the same feeling I got just before a critical systems test, a quiet, focused clarity. I'd seen this coming. Not the exact day or the exact buzzwords, but the event itself. It had been inevitable since the day Todd's brother-in-law, Gregory Thorne, took over as COO 2 years ago. Todd cleared his throat, a little annoyed by my silence. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal items. We'll have your tools and reference materials shipped to your home. I nodded slowly. That won't be necessary. My voice was steady, measured. My personal items are already at home. The tools and manuals belong to the company. He smirked, a flicker of victory in his eyes. He thought he'd won. He thought he was cutting a piece of old, expensive infrastructure from the budget. A line item on a spreadsheet. What Todd Vance didn't understand was that my final report wasn't going into the company archives. It was going somewhere else entirely. He had no idea that my signature, the one he was so eager to replace, had just armed a weapon he couldn't see, aimed directly at the foundation of the company he thought he was saving. If you like stories about quiet competence taking down loud arrogance, hit that like button and subscribe right now. You're going to want to see how this one ends. I started at Chempro in the summer of 1993. I was 23 years old, just out of the Army where I'd spent 4 years in the Chemical Corps. I knew my way around hazardous materials. The plant back then was a different beast, family owned by the Hemlocks, and run by people who had worked their way up from the factory floor. My first boss was a man named Arthur Hemlock, the founder's son. He was a tough, fair man who walked the plant every single day. He knew the names of every worker, their wives, their kids. He's the one who gave me the job in safety. In 1995, we had a close call, a chlorine leak in Sector Gamma. Nobody was seriously hurt, but it was a wake-up call. The investigation revealed a series of small, overlooked maintenance issues and a culture of getting it done over getting it done right. Arthur pulled me into his office. It was paneled in dark wood and smelled of cigar smoke and industrial soap. "Harold," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I need someone whose only job is to say no. Someone who isn't worried about production quotas or shipping deadlines. Someone who worries about a gasket failing at 3 in the morning." That became my job. For the next 28 years, I was that person. I wrote the safety protocols from the ground up. I designed the lockdown procedures. I implemented the digital monitoring system in 2005 that linked every critical sensor in the plant to a central hub. I reduced reportable incidents by 92% over my first decade. In 2008, a pressure surge in a benzene line triggered an automatic shutdown I had designed. It averted what the state investigators later called a potential catastrophe. I got a plaque and a $500 bonus. The real reward was knowing the system worked. My value wasn't on a balance sheet. It was in the incidents that never happened. It was in the quiet hum of the plant running smoothly, day after day, year after year. I was the institutional memory. I knew the maintenance history of every foot of pipe, every weld, every valve. I knew that the heat exchanger in sector beta had a peculiar vibration if the ambient temperature dropped below 40 degrees, and that the pump seals on the number 3 ethylene tank had to be replaced every 18 months, not the 24 the manufacturer recommended. This was knowledge earned over 31 years of walking the catwalks, listening to the machinery, and reading 10,000-page engineering manuals until the words blurred. Then, the Hemlock family sold the company. In February 2022, ChemPro was acquired by a private equity firm out of New York. The transition was brutal. The new owners installed Gregory Thorne as COO. Gregory was the son-in-law of one of the firm's senior partners. He was 45, with a background in marketing for a soft drink company. He saw the plant not as a complex, dangerous organism, but as a collection of assets to be squeezed for maximum return. He brought his wife's brother, Todd Vance, with him. Todd was made director of operations. On his first day, he walked into my office, looked at the schematics covering my walls, and said, "We need to digitize all this. Get it into the cloud for synergy." He had no idea it was all already digitized, cross-referenced, and backed up on 3 separate servers, a system I built myself. He just saw paper and assumed it was obsolete. That was his fatal flaw. He only saw the surface of things. The breaking point came about 18 months ago. Todd came to me with a proposal from a new supplier for pressure vessel gaskets. They were 30% cheaper. I ran the material specs. They were rated for 15% less thermal resistance than our current ones. I told him they were unacceptable for the lines carrying heated caustic soda. "It's within the acceptable tolerance range, Harold," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "The algorithm says it's a smart cost saving." "There is no algorithm for molten sodium hydroxide eating through a steel pipe," I told him. "We don't use them. I won't sign off on it." He stared at me, his jaw tight. A week later, he overrode my decision. He signed the purchase order himself. That was the first time. I made a copy of my report, a copy of his signed directive, and I put them in a folder. A new folder, separate from my work files. That night, I thought of old Arthur Hemlock. Right after that chlorine leak in '95, he'd told me something I never forgot. We were sharing a thermos of coffee at 4 a.m., watching the cleanup crew. "Kid," he said, "always keep a second set of books. Not for money, but for the truth. One for them, one for you. Document everything. One day, it'll be the only thing that saves you or this plant." For the next 18 months, I did just that. I built my secret weapon, piece by piece, memo by memo. My wife, Sarah, knew something was wrong. I was quieter at dinner. I stayed up later in my home office. My pension was fully vested, but we had 2 kids in college, a mortgage, and the dream of maybe retiring to a small house on a lake. All of that was tied to ChemPro. My entire professional life, my reputation, was built within those concrete walls. Losing that job meant losing more than a paycheck. It meant being erased. The corner cutting started small, the cheaper gaskets. Then it was stretching the maintenance intervals on the pumps. Todd called it dynamic scheduling. I called it rolling the dice. I'd file my official report. Pump 12C requires full service overhaul as per manufacturer's mandate, and internal protocol 7.4. Deferral is not recommended. An email would come back from Todd an hour later, CCing Gregory, deferring 12C maintenance to Q4 to align with budget priorities. Acknowledge. I would acknowledge. And I would print the email chain, attach my original report, and add it to the file. They stopped replacing pH sensors on schedule, claiming the new predictive analytics software would tell them when a sensor was about to fail. The software was a joke, a cheap subscription service that was no substitute for scheduled replacement. I documented the drift in the sensor readings, showing they were becoming less reliable. My report was ignored. I printed it out. They hired a cheaper third-party contractor for emissions testing. The new company's reports were always perfect, always just under the legal limit. I knew our output. I knew what the numbers should be. On 2 separate occasions, I used my own calibrated handheld air quality monitor, a Draeger XM 8000 I'd bought with my own money, to take readings near the primary flare stack. The sulfur dioxide levels were 40% higher than what the contractor was reporting. I took time-stamped photos of my readings, filed an official report questioning the contractor's data, and received a 1-sentence email from Todd. We stand by our certified partners. That email, along with my photos and the contractor's falsified report, went into the binder. Todd's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He believed his MBA and his title made him smarter than the man who had spent 31 years learning the language of the plant. He never once considered that the old guy in the worn-out work boots was meticulously building a case against him. He was too busy celebrating his own genius. He sent out company-wide emails praising his cost optimization initiatives, which had saved the company, on paper, about $1.6 million in the last year. He had no idea the deferred liability he was creating was 100 times that. He bought a new Tesla Model S Plaid. He started parking it in the spot once reserved for Arthur Hemlock. I finalized the evidence 3 weeks ago. I had compiled 2 years of willful, documented negligence into a 400-page report. It was divided into 7 sections, corresponding to the 7 major categories of OSHA and EPA regulations being violated. Each entry contained the date, the specific piece of equipment, the regulation being broken, for example citing 29 CFR 1910-1119, Process Safety Management of Highly Hazardous Chemicals, my official recommendation, Todd's or Gregory's written override, and my own supplementary evidence, photos, independent readings, material spec sheets. It was an ironclad case. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It was a simple, damning narrative of greed and incompetence. I made 3 copies, one on an encrypted thumb drive, which I kept in a safe deposit box. One was a hard copy, bound in a plain black binder, which sat on my desk at home. The third was formatted as a secured PDF, ready to be attached to an email. When Todd called me into that conference room, I knew it was time. He was so proud of himself, so sure he was making a smart, executive decision. He saw a salary of $112,000 a year and thought he could replace it with Barry at $65,000 and bank the difference. He wasn't just firing an employee. He was silencing the only alarm bell the plant had left. After I left the meeting, I didn't go to my office. I walked straight out the main gate, past the security guard who wished me a good evening, just like he had for the past 20 years. I got into my 2014 Ford F-150, the one I'd bought new after the benzene incident bonus. The engine turned over with a familiar, reliable rumble. I drove home. Sarah met me at the door. She saw the look on my face and knew. She didn't say anything, just put her arms around me. "It's okay," I told her, and for the first time in 2 years, I knew it really was. It's time to finish my work. I went to my study, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. I pulled up a new email. The to field was pre-filled, the public whistleblower tip line for the regional EPA office, and the direct email for the head of the regional OSHA Enforcement Division. The subject line was simple: Formal Whistleblower Report. Imminent dangers and willful violations at Chempro Industries, Port Arthur. I wrote a brief 3-paragraph summary. Then I attached the file. The 400-page report. My life's work. My final report. I hovered the cursor over the send button for a moment. Then I clicked it. The timestamp on the email read 4:17 p.m. The chaos I had predicted began quietly. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. I imagined Todd and Barry striding through the plant, clueless. Barry was probably asking what the big red buttons did, and Todd was probably telling him not to worry about it. I spent those 2 days cleaning out my garage. It was methodical, calming work. The emergency I created wasn't a chemical spill. It was a bureaucratic one, far more efficient, and just as devastating. The confrontation happened on a Wednesday morning, 5 days after I was fired. I know this because I got a call later that day from a friend who still worked in engineering. He told me the story with a mixture of awe and terror. At 10 a.m., Todd Vance was in a senior leadership meeting on the 3rd floor. He was presenting a slideshow full of charts showing downward trending operational expenses. He was projecting a 12% increase in profit margins for the quarter. He was, my friend said, at the absolute peak of his confidence. He'd just made a joke about trimming the fat. That's when Gregory Thorne's assistant burst into the room, her face pale. "Gregory, you need to come to the front gate. Now." Gregory and Todd arrived at the main entrance to find not 1 or 2 government cars, but a convoy. 6 dark blue sedans and 2 white vans with federal plates. About 15 people were standing there, wearing windbreakers with bold yellow letters: EPA, OSHA, FBI. The lead agent, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and an expression that tolerated no nonsense, presented a search warrant. It was thick as a novel. Her name was Senior Agent Miller. She didn't ask for permission. She informed them of the protocol. "We'll be conducting a full-spectrum safety and environmental compliance audit," she stated, her voice carrying over the plant's hum. "Your cooperation is required. Our investigation is based on a detailed report alleging significant and willful violations." Todd started to bluster. "Now, hold on. I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding. We have a perfect safety record." Agent Miller looked down at a tablet in her hand. "Is your name Todd Vance?" He nodded. "Did you, on April 12th of this year, sign a directive deferring critical maintenance on the primary sulfuric acid storage tank T1138? Todd's face went white. My friend said it was like watching a balloon deflate. That was a standard procedural decision to align with budgetary. "The report I have," Miller cut him off, "alleges that this deferral violates 29 CFR 1910.119 and that the tank's wall thickness is now potentially below minimum safety thresholds. We have a team with an ultrasonic scanner on its way to that tank right now." She looked past him. "We'll need to speak with your senior safety officer." That's when Barry was summoned. He came jogging out, looking confused. Agent Miller asked him 3 basic questions about the plant's pressure relief systems. Barry couldn't answer. He couldn't name the primary chemical catalyst used in Sector Gamma. He just stood there, stammering. The power shift was instantaneous and absolute. The agents swarmed the plant. They moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. They knew exactly where to go. They had my report. It was their roadmap. They went straight to the pump with the overdue maintenance. They took samples from the flare stack. They pulled the cheaper gaskets and began material analysis on site. Gregory Thorne's authority vanished. Todd Vance's arrogance crumbled into panicked denial. The agents weren't listening to them. They were listening to the ghost of Harold Brennan. My report was doing the talking for me. Its cold, factual voice echoing through every action the federal team took. My phone rang at 2:22 p.m. The caller ID was a blocked number. It was Agent Miller. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice crisp and professional. We have acted on the information you provided. The situation here is consistent with your report. We would like to retain you as an official consultant for the duration of this investigation, effective immediately. Your expertise would be invaluable. I was no longer the fired employee. I was the expert witness for the United States government. I can do that, I said calmly. My consulting fee is $300 an hour, 4-hour minimum per day. There was a brief pause. That's acceptable, she said. We'll have a car pick you up in the morning. The aftermath was a slow, systematic dismantling of everything Gregory and Todd had built. I spent the next 6 weeks walking the federal agents through the plant I knew better than my own home. I showed them the patched-up pipes, the jury-rigged sensors, the logbooks Todd thought no one would ever read. Chempro was fined $23.8 million by the EPA for the emissions violations alone. OSHA added another $7.2 million in fines for the safety breaches, one of the largest penalties they'd issued that decade. The plant was shut down for 3 months for a complete overhaul, costing the company an estimated $50 million in lost production. The total cost of their optimization was well over $80 million, not including the legal fees. The cost to bring the plant back into compliance was 10 times the $1.6 million Todd had been so proud of saving. Todd Vance was fired, of course. He was also indicted by a federal grand jury on 12 counts, including conspiracy to defraud the United States, violations of the Clean Air Act, and making false statements. His emails, the ones I had so carefully saved, were the prosecution's star exhibits. He pleaded guilty to avoid a longer sentence and is currently serving 36 months in a federal minimum security prison. His Brioni suits were replaced with an orange jumpsuit. Gregory Thorne was forced to resign in disgrace by the parent company. He was hit with a massive personal fine from the SEC for misleading investors about the company's operational liabilities. The family connection that had given him his career was now an anchor dragging him to the bottom. Last I heard, he'd sold his mansion and was living in a condo. Barry, the former car salesman, was fired the day the agents arrived. He wasn't charged, but his name was so thoroughly disgraced in the local industry, he couldn't find work. He's now managing a Jiffy Lube over in Beaumont. The board members who had enabled Gregory's slash and burn approach were all forced out by the parent firm, their reputations tarnished. The company's stock dropped 40% and took a year to recover. I formed Brennan Safety Solutions. My first client was a law firm representing a class action lawsuit filed by Chempro employees against the company for knowingly putting them at risk. My testimony was central to their case, which settled for an undisclosed 8-figure sum. My company now consults for chemical plants all over the Gulf Coast. They hire me to do what I did at Chempro for 31 years. Tell them the truth. My reputation for uncompromising integrity is the best marketing I could ask for. I work when I want. I charge what I'm worth, and I've never been more respected. We paid off the house. The college funds are full. Sarah and I bought that little house on Lake Sam Rayburn. I spend my weekends teaching my grandson how to fish, something I never had enough time for before. The constant low-grade stress that I carried for 2 years is gone, replaced by a deep sense of peace. Sometimes I drive past the Chempro plant. It looks different now. Cleaner, safer. They had to invest over $100 million in upgrades to get it running again. They have a team of 6 full-time safety officers to do the job I once did alone. They thought my value was in my title, a line item they could easily erase. They never understood that my real value was in my signature. For 31 years, that signature was a promise to every person who walked through those gates that I was watching out for them. It was a promise I kept, right up to the very end. The contracts and regulations they tried to ignore became the very tools that ensured justice was served. Some people build their legacies with steel and concrete. I built mine with paper and ink. Turns out, that's the kind that lasts.